Hey guys, and welcome to our Thursday. We're going to finish up the notes here on civil rights and push through a couple of our slides here, and then we're going to make sure that we try to get you prepared for the exam that you're going to take on Monday of next week. Okay, it's going to cover chapters 4 and chapter 5 from our textbook. That's our unit 3. We'll do the entire thing, including the FRQ on the class marker. Okay, so this is where we left off talking about voter rights, specifically talking about Wisconsin ID and voter ID laws that many states basically implemented. So the textbook basically does exactly what most textbooks do. They're basically looking at when they're looking at the concept of civil rights is like, here we go, we're going to talk about civil rights at the very end, and like, oh yes, there's also these other groups that are included. They go through these very, very quickly. They don't spend much time on them. We talk about Native Americans in the textbook, and obviously the United States history of Native Americans is horrendous, right? This is a black spot on American history. We have never treated Native Americans well in this country from the very beginning, and we still are struggling with this even today. And the book basically focuses on one thing, and that's the Indian Bill of Rights that was passed in the 1960s that basically applied all of the provisions that we normally think of with the Bill of Rights and extended that to the tribal governments and the tribal nations to make sure that they were also included and had the protection of the Bill of Rights. But it took them till 1968 in order to do that. So, a couple hundred years before we figured that out. Hispanic Americans, here's an interesting one that we could be looking at into great detail, especially as right now with what's going on. And we basically have ignored this for the most part because our textbook isn't up to date kind of thing. So the Supreme Court basically has extended the protection from discrimination to Hispanics. It basically states that it doesn't matter what your legal standing is here in the United States, that if you are a minor, we still require you to be educated, and that it doesn't matter the legal standing, a child basically deserves an education. So Asian Americans, the big thing that they focused on there is Korematsu, the Supreme Court case of Korematsu versus the United States in 1944. This is during World War II, where we basically took Japanese Americans, many of them being U.S. citizens, during World War II, and we basically put them into encampments during the entire war, even though they had been committed no crimes. They had been accused of a crime. We basically locked them up because of their nationality, or at least their heritage. Like I said, a large percent of the people that were in these camps basically were actually American citizens. Many of them were native-born U.S. citizens, had never, been to Japan, and yet they got placed into those camps right alongside their grandparents and their parents and so forth and stuff like that. Eventually, the United States did apologize for that treatment and did provide some retribution for it. In some form of money, but it took them about, I think it was like the late 1980s before we actually apologized for it. Looking at women, we've talked about women in Congress, we talked about women in politics, we talked about the lack of numbers we see there. And if we basically had to look at this overall thing, like, women basically have the worst showing in the United States political arena than any other minority group. Percentage-wise, I mean, women make up about 51% of the United States population, and yet they make up a really small fraction of members of Congress and so forth. The textbook goes over very quickly a history of women fighting for the rights. It has to basically, mention Seneca Falls, this famous moment in women history, in U.S. history, where women basically laid down what they were looking for, what rights they wanted. And it's really kind of considered to be the beginning of the suffrage movement for women getting the right to vote, which of course they were granted in 1920. So with that 19th Amendment, in 1920, we passed the 19th Amendment that guaranteed women the right to vote. And then there's this great example, and I believe we've talked about this in class, of the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, which basically came up way back in the 1920s, but it really took hold in the 1970s. And it looked like the ERA, which was the Equal Rights Amendment, which basically stated that women had to be given equal rights as a man. Is really as clear-cut and simple as it could be. And it looked like it was going to quickly blow through and pass all of the states that were needed to become the next amendment to the United States Constitution. And then it hit a brick wall. mainly in the force of women who were opposed to the ERA, ironically enough. And we watched that John Oliver video about that, I believe. If not, let me know. I always can show it for you. Women in the workplace, this is one of these things where it's been a struggle all along. It used to be common practice that if you were if you owned a company and you hired a woman and she either she got pregnant, the common practice was that you were going to release her from her job, that she was going to be fired. If she got pregnant, she was going to be fired, and she probably wouldn't be invited back after she had the child. Right? In 1978, we passed the Pregnancy Discrimination Act that made it illegal for your boss to basically fire you for that, and also to exclude pregnancy as part of your health benefits. So it's mind-boggling to think, but that means up until 1978, your health insurance company may not consider you actually growing another human being inside of you as part of your health risks and health benefits. So it's kind of mind-boggling, but we still have a long ways to go with some of this stuff. And then this was the last thing that they talk about, and that's wage discrimination. As we know, that women basically are making about 80% or 80 cents on the dollar for what a man is making for doing comparable jobs. President Barack Obama signed a bill into law to outlaw that discrimination. That bill has had a lot of kickback on it recently with the current administration trying to remove some of those protections. And then they show you this disturbing, graph that shows going all the way back to 1985 how little. I mean, they try to say like, look, things are getting better, and sure they are, but they're still a long ways from being good, right? Going from basically 70% of what a man makes to 80% of what a man makes, in the last 25 years type of thing is not exactly great progress, at least in my opinion. So the last couple of things that they want to talk about is the concept of, they talk about graying to America, about how we're getting older, and we're seeing, obviously, we talked about these baby boomers, the much greater numbers. They're reaching their 60s, 65, 70s, 75, and so forth. And that's going to lead to an economic burden in some aspects with things like Social Security and Medicare, but it also basically makes sure that we want to classify them so that they fall underneath the anti-discrimination laws that we talked about in the beginning. And then the book goes into talking about civil rights for people with disabilities. It was 1990 before we passed the Americans with Disability Act in the United States, which basically requires employers to try to make reasonable accommodations for somebody who has a disability. So if you have a disability, but you can still perform a job perfectly fine, maybe with some reasonable and low-cost accommodations made to the job. For example, Walmart likes their cashiers to basically stand for some reason while they work. But let's say you had a disability that makes it impossible for you to stand for long periods of time. They can provide you a chair, right? It's not an unreasonable accommodation to basically have. The Civil Rights, the Americans with Disability Act also basically required us to take certain buildings, public buildings, and make sure that people with disability had equal access to the areas of the buildings. Things like schools and government offices and stuff like that. It actually was a really significant bill, the Americans with Disability Act, as far as helping people with disabilities to become more involved and a part of and included in our civilization. So big bill there. The last thing right here is about gay and lesbian rights. We're talking about the LGBTQ community. The thing they focus on, and I understand why, is the legalization of gay marriage, which I don't believe the book does talk about this. Yeah. So in 1996, even under President Bill Clinton, a Democratic president, the United States passed a law called DOMA, D-O-M-A, Defense of Marriage Act. And basically what it does, it states that, marriage was between a man and a woman, national law. And here's why. We started to see states like Hawaii starting out and stuff like that, where the Supreme Court of Hawaii basically said, look, us not allowing a gay couple to get married is against the Constitution, so we're going to allow gay marriage. And then the problem came for the other 49 states was like, okay, well, we recognize an Hawaiian marriage license. If we recognize a marriage license, but we're not going to recognize this particular marriage license because it's of a same-sex couple, isn't that a violation of the 14th Amendment? Equal protection of the law. And the obvious answer is absolutely, 100% it is. And so DOMA got passed, which basically said that states could disregard same-sex marriages performed in other states if they wanted to. Okay. And that's how it went. And I'll be honest, this is one of these things where we see a dramatic change in the public perception of gay marriage over a very short period of time, really, compared to a lot of other civil rights issues and stuff like that. If I would have asked this classroom of high school kids 15 years ago their opinions on gay marriage, it would have been skewed towards we shouldn't allow gay marriage. And now in this day and age, it's overwhelmingly, of course, we should allow gay marriage. And the Supreme Court finally clarified that with the Supreme Court case of Obergefell, tough name to say, Obergefell versus Hodges. And that was a 5-4 ruling. It wasn't 9-0, it was 5-4. That basically says that marriage is a guaranteed right to all couples, and that by basically not allowing gay couples to get married, it was a violation of their equal protection right of the 14th Amendment. I would recommend that you take a second and take a couple of minutes and read through the majority opinion written on this case. It's beautifully written, and he talks about there about how here are a group of people who love each other and want to be included in what is one of the longest standing marks of our society, marriage, and we have no reason or rational reason to basically deny them that right. Now, gay marriage basically is now allowed in all 50 states because of that Supreme Court case. But that doesn't mean that all rights are. There are still a multitude number of states that can basically fire a person for being gay, can deny them the right to live in an apartment building, deny them a lease, deny them a mortgage, all of these different things that basically we still don't see gay and lesbian rights being protected. So this is John Oliver's video on looking at gay rights and why the LGBTQ community still is fighting for rights because they're not being protected in a large number of the 50 states. So I'll post this with you in our Google Classroom, and you can take a look at it. All right. That covers our entire chapter. We should be all set. Tomorrow, what we're going to do is, if you're available, at 1:30 on Friday, we're going to do a little bit of a review. I thought we'd play a little Kahoot together. And then afterwards, we'll do a Netflix party to watch the next episode of The West Wing. You don't have to be there for it at 1:30 exactly. I'll post the review stuff online so you get the review. None of it's required, but I thought it'd be a nice little change for us. Okay. All right. You guys have a good day. Stay safe. And like always, make sure you wash your hands.